You are listening to a programme from BBC Radio 4.
On the 24th of July, 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte was brought to the south coast of England on the Royal Navy warship HMS Bellerophon. Following his defeat at Waterloo, he was hoping for a gentlemanly imprisonment on an English country estate. But the British Prime Minister, Lord Liverpool, had other ideas.
It would not answer to confine him in this country. He would become the object of curiosity immediately, and possibly of compassion in the course of a few months. St. Helena is the place in the world best calculated for the confinement of such a person. At such a place and such a distance, all intrigue would be impossible, and being so far from the European world, he would soon be forgotten.
2 centuries on, of course, Napoleon has been far from forgotten. But the question of how he should be remembered divides opinion to this day. In this final episode, I want to dispel some of the myths about his death and his legacy. Anchoring at Torbay and then Plymouth on the English south coast, Napoleon immediately became a huge draw for sightseers. 1,000 pleasure boats collected around the ship, hoping for a glimpse of him. Napoleon's arrival in Britain meant that the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars were over. On the 31st of July, Admiral Lord Keith and Sir Henry Bunbury, the Under-Secretary of State for War, arrived in HMS Bellerophon to tell Napoleon of his St. Helenan fate. Britain and France had gone to war 8 times for a total of 56 years between 1689 and 1815, and the 100 days following Napoleon's return from Elba had cost nearly 100,000 men killed and wounded from all sides, and no repetition could ever be risked. Napoleon was devastated at the news.
I would prefer being delivered up to the Bourbons. Among other insults, they style me general. They may as well call me archbishop.
I've come here to the British Museum to view the exhibition Bonaparte and the British. Many of the myths about Napoleon began with these prints and portraits. For example, Napoleon would have hated this cartoon here by James Gilray, published in 1803. It's called King Brobdingnag and Gulliver. In it, King George III is holding a tiny Napoleon in the palm of one hand. Inspecting him through a telescope, the king quotes Gulliver's Travels, where he describes Napoleon as one of the most pernicious little odious reptiles that nature ever suffered to crawl upon the surface of the earth. However, it's apparent from this exhibition that Napoleon was not simply a hate figure to the British, he was also an object of deep fascination. But why was Napoleon so fascinating? In my opinion, he was the most daring and dynamic figure of his age. Living proof that individual heroes could still make a difference and that greatness could be attained through hard work, risk-taking and talent rather than just birth. As George Hume, a midshipman on HMS Bellerophon, said,
He showed us what one little human creature like ourselves could accomplish in a span so short.
Here at the British Museum, I'm looking at a French print by Lacroix. It shows Napoleon in a metal dustbin, with the Prussian General Blücher and Wellington standing over it, pressing down on the lid. Blücher is complaining that Napoleon is being allowed to breathe, while Wellington assures him that he's finished. Unlike the Bourbons and Prussians who wanted to execute him, the British wanted to exile Napoleon to St. Helena. The island has been described as further away from anywhere else in the world. I've been there, and even now it takes 6 days to get there by boat from Cape Town. Living on St. Helena, having once ruled most of Europe, was considered a tough enough punishment by the British. Napoleon was very unimpressed.
It is not an attractive place. I should have done better to have remained in Egypt.
It is, of course, one of the many myths surrounding Napoleon that he was killed by the British on St. Helena, alleging that he was poisoned with arsenic. It's true that Napoleon might have benefited from a better doctor than the barely competent Francesco Antomarchi, but nothing could alter the ultimate outcome once stomach cancer had taken hold. As Dr. Walter Henry, the staff surgeon guarding him, noted,
From the first, Napoleon appeared to be aware of the nature of his malady, referring to it as a disease of the stomach of which his father died, and with which the Princess Pauline Borghese was threatened.
In total, Napoleon spent over 5.5 years on St Helena. Freed of responsibilities, he allowed himself a good deal of levity at the beginning, almost a second childhood. When one of the English children called him by his British nickname, Boney, he didn't understand the allusion, pointing out what was all too obvious by then, due to his obesity.
I am not at all bony.
He would spend up to 12 hours a day dictating his memoirs. What a novel my life has been, he said, and his retelling of it certainly owed much more to fiction than to fact. He was aware of the cartoons and prints such as this one here by Charles Williams. Published in 1804, it's called The Cold-Blooded Murderer, or The Assassination of the Duc d'Enghien. This print shows the Duke tied up against a tree while Napoleon kills him with his sabre. 5 black, demon-like monkeys dance in delight above Napoleon's head, 2 of which bear a crown. Napoleon very much wanted his memoirs to confound this kind of image, and instead to glorify his victories.
Many faults, no doubt, will be found in my career, but Arcole, Rivoli, the pyramids, Marengo, Austerlitz, Jena, Friedland. These are granite. The teeth of envy are powerless here.
Once published 2 years after his death, Napoleon's memoirs became the greatest international bestseller of the 19th century. His extensive architectural achievements also acted as a constant reminder to the French public of their former emperor. No more so than in Paris, which is where I'm headed on the train today. In fact, it was Napoleon himself who first came up with the idea of digging a tunnel under the Channel to invade Britain. Taken as a whole over his short reign, Napoleon built an astonishing amount of what he called my true treasures. To quote the emperor himself,
I wanted my capital to excel by its splendor all other cities of the world. I did everything, planned to do everything, for Paris.
no one could drive building projects forward like Napoleon. And the ways he improved and beautified not only Paris, but the whole French Empire is astonishing. In 1804, he said to one of his generals,
"Men are only great through the monuments they leave behind."
The Rue de Rivoli here in central Paris is one of Europe's most beautiful thoroughfares. It runs east to west across the city in an unbroken line of three-storey neoclassical buildings with identical facades. It's named after the Battle of Rivoli, one of Napoleon's victories against the Austrians in Italy. This elegant promenade allows us to glimpse what Napoleon's Paris might have looked like had he not been exiled, for he wanted to build monuments such as the Arc de Triomphe de Carrousel, which stands not far from me here, to perpetuate the memory of those who had died fighting for France, to overawe friend and foe, and to exhibit the genius of artists of the empire. The accusation that these monuments were simply just to glorify Napoleon is therefore misplaced. Napoleon's bridges span the Seine, and his reservoirs, canals and sewers are still in use. France's foreign ministry rests on top of part of the 2.5 miles of stone quays he built along the river. Even his greatest enemy, Louis XVIII, joked on his return from exile,
"He was a good tenant, that Bonaparte."
Equally long-lasting were Napoleon's civil reforms. Though France was forced back to its pre-Napoleonic frontiers by the end of 1815, most of Napoleon's refashioning of the country was sufficiently well embedded by then that it could not be reversed by the Bourbons when they returned to power. The Napoleonic Code forms the basis of much of European law today, and the Cour des Comptes still checks public spending accounts.
My true glory is not to have won 40 battles. What nothing will destroy, what will live forever, is my civil code.
In 1802, Napoleon promised the Conseil d'État an education system that would turn out future administrators and technicians. And the secondary school lycée system was his answer to the question of how to create a patriotic, loyal generation of future leaders. By 1813, they were the best schools in Europe, and some of Napoleon's original lycées, such as the one I'm in now, are still amongst the best in France today. In a speech to the Conseil, Napoleon argued that education was
the most important of all the institutions, since everything depends upon it, the present and the future. Let us have a body of doctrine that does not vary, and a body of teachers which does not die.
Despite Napoleon's exile in 1815 and his death on St Helena in 1821, the emperor's image and influence was everywhere in France. Victor Hugo's 1828 poem Louis describes the omnipresence of the former emperor.
Toujours Louis, Louis partout, always him, him everywhere. The same eye that flees you, finds you everywhere, always casting a long shadow over today's pictures. Napoleon always dazzling and dark, standing on the threshold of the century.
But walking around central Paris, one thing is really striking. At every turn, there are streets and monuments celebrating Napoleon's great victories, Austerlitz, the pyramids, and so on. But not a single square or street in central Paris is named after the emperor himself. And whilst his tomb at Les Invalides is extravagant, France doesn't officially celebrate any Napoleonic anniversaries. There is but one statue of Napoleon on the streets of central Paris. I've come to the fashionable Place Vendôme, which is home to haute couturiers, the Ministry of Justice, and the Ritz Hotel. Right in front of me, in the very centre, is a 130-foot-high obelisk commissioned by Napoleon in 1806 to commemorate the Battle of Austerlitz. On the very top was a statue of the emperor, dressed as Mars, the god of war. It was torn down and replaced several times by subsequent regimes. He's still there today, looking out over Paris, though the column itself doesn't take his name. It's known as the Vendôme column. This tells us something about Napoleon's mixed legacy in France today. The country is still divided. Those on the right tend to revere Napoleon as a strong, enlightened leader, whilst those on the left still see him as a belligerent tyrant. The unmistakable ambiguities of Napoleon's character and rule have allowed subsequent generations to reinterpret his complex image and legacy to suit their own political and social reality. The numerous myths created by both Napoleon himself and his opponents have added to this ambivalence. In the last century, Napoleon's reputation was greatly tarnished by Hitler and Mussolini's admiration for him. Today, Napoleon's star is rising once again as we look beyond the prism of World War II and view his career in context. The Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars cost around 3 million military and 1 million civilian deaths. Napoleon must, of course, take much of the responsibility for these, but I believe he cannot be accused of being the only, or even the principal, warmonger of his age. There are two ways of constructing an international order, wrote Henry Kissinger in 1973, by will or by renunciation, by conquest or by legitimacy. Only the way of will and conquest was open to Napoleon, and he followed it. But even if he had not been one of the great conquerors, Napoleon would still be one of the giants of modern history, for his civil achievements equalled his military ones and far outlasted them. When Napoleon's mother was complimented on her son's achievements, she replied, "Mais pourvu que ça dure," so long as they last. And they have.
You can download many more BBC Radio 4 programmes for free. Find these at bbc.co.uk/Radio4.